Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel. Honestly, you don't want to be taking generic legal advice from a YouTube channel or podcast in any event. On with the show. You catch more files with Honey, Stardock, Star Control, and Settlement. Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing partner of the Hoeg Law business law firm. And today we're talking a little bit more about E3, the Electronic Entertainment Expo, but actually news that occurred earlier in 3. And I got contacted a lot about this on my Twitter, on my social media, because as it turns out, Stardock, Star Control, and the creators behind the original Star Control series wound up getting together and settling their differences. And I got contacted about this because if you've been following Virtual Legality, earlier in the year, I actually wound up doing a series on the legal fight between Stardock and the Toys for Bob crew because so much was happening around that litigation. They issued a DMCA takedown notice on Star Control that wound up getting it removed for a short time from those stores, and a whole lot happened from there. And it looked like everything was getting more and more litigious, more and more confrontational, really until this last week. And so let's take a look at the story that I originally commented on for GameDailyBiz, and then a follow-up from Ars Technica that goes into great detail about what happened here. And it's an interesting story, absolutely. Before we get into it, I do want to give the disclaimer that I gave on my previous Stardock videos, which is that the Hoeg Law business law firm of Northville, Michigan, is right down the street from Stardock of Plymouth, Michigan, literally a 5-minute drive. And because of my love for video games and my book of business that consists of video game developers and clients in the information technology sphere, I have been to visit Stardock. I have been to visit Brad Wardell numerous times. I've had lunch with them. I've had lunch with other Stardockians. I've met with them at International Game Developers Association meetings. I did not represent them on anything to do with this case. I have only ever briefly talked about it with Brad on maybe one occasion. And so I want to give that disclaimer because I think it's important to know where everybody sits and what kind of interests they might have so that you can properly adjudge the things I'm about to talk about. Certainly because it's been settled and now everybody seems amicable about the whole situation. There's not a lot of bias to be built into this discussion, but I do think those disclosures are important, and so I give it to you happily at the beginning of this video or podcast. Now we look at the GameDaily.biz article, and its headline is Stardock and Star Control creators have reached a settlement. Star Control creators Fred Ford and Paul Reiche III have withdrawn their opposition to Stardock's trademark for Star Control, and they are now teaming up with Stardock on a new game called Beekeeping. And I want to get to that update in just a second because they did give some quotes. They did do some talking on their own site, but I like the way Ars Technica has described all of this as a story, as a narrative. So I want to essentially talk about what this looked like when it happened, look at what Ars Technica said, and then at the end of it, look at what Stardock has said about what's happened. So the original story here was that earlier this year, Game Daily reported on the ongoing legal battle between PC developer Stardock and the creators of the Star Control series, Paul Reiche III and Fred Ford. According to a blog post from the creators and a legal document describing a settlement between the parties, it's clear that their legal squabble has come to an end. Stardock and Fungi Games, Fred and Paul, are happy and relieved to announce that all parties have settled their disputes amicably and in a way where the fans of Star Control and the Urquan Masters, that's Fred and Paul's name for what Star Control 2 and kind of the original recipe Star Control is, are the biggest winners, Reiche III and Ford wrote. Fungi Games is no longer opposing Stardock's control of the Star Control trademark, and it now makes clear on the website that Star Control is a registered trademark of Stardock Systems. And GameDailyBiz contacted me really the morning that this started to get released and said, hey, Rick, what do you think happened here? And I gave him a few comments, but one of the primary ones is just to note how many things settle. When we talk about litigation, when we talk about lawsuits, lawsuits are essentially a function of a disagreement between parties as to what the chances of winning in litigation actually are. Said another way, lawyers are a dead weight cost. You go into litigation with a specific set of facts on your side. We're talking about commercial litigation here, contract law. And Stardock thinks one thing and thinks that they've got a certain percentage chance of winning. And Fred and Paul think another thing and think they have a certain percentage chance of winning. If those align at all, if, say, Frenji thinks that what they have a chance of winning is worth $1 million and they have a 50% chance of winning it, and Stardock basically thinks the same thing, where we're talking about the same amount of money that's at stake, and everybody has an expected value of the litigation at, say, $500,000, then payment to lawyers to kind of litigate that, to get confrontational, to have all these bills rack up for years and years and years, are essentially lost. That if you've got the same kind of lawyers on either side and they're representing your case in the way that you would expect, it doesn't really change the percentage chance of winning over the long haul. You wind up paying the same bill. You wind up having the same expected value for the lawsuit after having paid lawyers hundreds of thousands of dollars than you do if you don't pay those lawyers hundreds of thousands of dollars. So litigation actually happens when you have a massive disagreement about where those percentage chances live. If Stardock, for instance, thought it had a 99% chance of winning, and Fred and Paul also thought it had a 99% chance of winning, that becomes a fight because they're essentially on opposite ends of the spectrum of what they think the expected value of the litigation is. And that, in that case, it makes sense to pay lawyers to try to get things to a litigated conclusion because you think you're going to make more money paying the lawyers and whatever limited payment you're going to make to Stardock or to Frenji or whichever side of the case that you're on. But over the course of discovery, over the course of starting to litigate something, you wind up getting a better feeling for what your chances actually are. And with that better information, one, you wind up knowing exactly how much lawyers cost, especially litigators in commercial transactions, which is a lot of money. And two, you start to become more and more cognizant of what the actual expected value of the litigation is. And if you're doing things right, both sides kind of get this feeling at the same time. And that's why when we take a look at the actual percentage of cases that settle, and there's a lot of different literature on this, but it's important to know, and it's important enough to know for something like virtual legality, this video and this podcast, that it's a heck of a lot of these cases. I've pulled up a Black's Law Dictionary article, which is mostly not related to commercial transactions. This was actually built into their personal injury settlement section, but what they say is very generalized. And so they say, if you're on either side of a pending lawsuit, you may be nervous about the prospect of going to trial. If you're like most Americans, you've probably never been directly involved in the trial process, although it's likely that you've seen stylized media portrayals of sleazy trial lawyers, forceful judges, and rigid courtroom protocols. You may not even know what to expect once you're actually stepped through the double doors and enter your trial court. In fact, you might not even be aware that most modern courtrooms lack double doors. And that's the cute entryway to say most people aren't familiar with the litigation process. And even when you get into the litigation process, there's a lot of variables like the ones we just talked about. And as a result, according to the most recently available statistics, about 95% of pending lawsuits end in a pre-trial settlement. Everybody gets together, understands what their expected value is. Even if there's a small difference between those expected values, you essentially negotiate it like any other contract term. You arrive at a midpoint where everybody's happy/unhappy, and you go your separate ways without having to pay lawyers for a 3-week trial and all of the expense that goes with that, because you can basically see the forest for the trees when you get close enough to the trial process. So it's not at all unusual for cases to settle, which is what I wound up telling GameDailyBiz. I said, in general, almost all lawsuits end in settlement as the costs rack up, and it becomes clear that each side is only estimating at its chances of success with a significant downside for failure. So this was always the most likely outcome. Though if they truly are working together or with each other's support for future games, that is at least one step more amicable than the usual walk-away settlement. And that's me quoting myself from this GameDailyBiz article, but obviously I believe that. I think that most cases settle because you have this kind of economics of law question, and when you can see things a little bit better, after it turns out that there isn't a smoking gun email in the other side's discovery, or there is, then everybody can agree on what the chances of success are, and they can agree on what a settlement should look like. In this particular case, however, it became something of a story that's a little bit different than even that kind of standard everybody settles talk. And that's one of the reasons I'm making this video, is because this article is absolutely hilarious, and it really does go to the idiosyncrasies that abound in the video game community. And it's one of the reasons that I love working with video game entrepreneurs and gaming in general, is because a lot of these folks have this passion, have this individual ownership over their intellectual property, their companies, the direction that they're going in. And so you don't get stuck in all of these bureaucracies necessarily until you start talking about the bigger publishers. And obviously those are great too, but they're a more standard kind of corporate relationship. And this clearly wasn't. So let's take a look at this article. This is from Ars Technica. And it says at the top line, "Honey, I settled the lawsuit. Stardock and Star Control creators settle lawsuits with mead and honey," which, as it turns out, is not a metaphor. It's actually a literal interpretation of what happened here. And I find it absolutely fantastic. "A surprising and surprisingly amicable conclusion to the multi-year legal saga." So let's take a look at some of the items here. Stardock's Brad Wardell and original Star Control creators Fred Ford and Paul Reiche III announced over the weekend that all parties have reached an amicable settlement in the tangled web of lawsuits between them and Stardock, which stretched back almost 2 years. Then they give a short recap, which we talked about at the top of this video. "The settlement's details are public, and Ford and Reiche have a blog post on their site explaining things. In summary, though, the terms are simple and straightforward. All existing lawsuits between Stardock and Ford and Reiche are dismissed with prejudice, and that's a legal term of art. It means you can't bring the same case back. If it was dismissed without prejudice, that means you can change some things, you can refile it later on. This says this goes away. It's a complete settlement. We're not going to talk about this stuff anymore. All parties are responsible for their own attorney's fees. You pay your own stuff. We're just wiping the slate clean. Stardock gets to use the Star Control name for its Star Control Origins game, which was always their strongest case. It certainly looked from the entirety of the case that they owned the trademark, they bought it at auction. Everybody was kind of arguing about everything they possibly could to see what stuck to the wall. And in my opinion, of course, Ford and Reiche's claim that there was a problem with the trademark was always one of their weakest claims against Stardock. And Stardock can develop sequels and DLCs to Star Control Origins as it likes, which, as a game fan, as a fan of my number 2 2018 Game of the Year, Star Control Origins, check out that video on my YouTube channel as well, I am thrilled about. Actually, everybody that is at all invested in the Star Control saga, Star Control universe, Star Control game franchise should be thrilled about all of this, because as a best case scenario, it means we're getting more companies supporting Star Control and Star Control type products, and that's a win for everybody that likes that gameplay and loves that franchise. Ford and Reiche get to continue to develop their own direct Urquan Masters sequel, which was previously called Ghost of the Precursors, but will be renamed. So they're going to get to make their own Star Control game. The Star Control Origins universe, now known as the Star Control franchise, will continue in a disconnected bubble from the Urquan Masters Ghost of the Precursors universe, now known as the Urquan Masters franchise. So they're going to have a complete split, which was the original plan. If you go back and you look at Stardock's original commentary on what was going to be Star Control Origins before things got a little frictional between the two parties, Star Control Origins was always going to keep kind of its own bubble because they didn't want to press on the Star Control 2-ness of what Ford and Reiche had created. But that went away a little bit when people wanted to press on each other's intellectual property, and that led to a lot of the issues in litigation. Reiche will contribute some writing to the Origins universe in a volunteer role. This is fantastic. We're going to get some of the original writing, some of the mind behind the original Star Control writing in the Origins universe, and all of the complicated arguments about who owns which copyrights and trademarks and who they bought them from and when and what's copyrightable and what's not are mooted. They go away. We're not going to fight about the intellectual property. And which is great, as the author says, because it means I don't have to re-summarize the mountain of IP arguments that both sides were making, some of which were okay, some of which were not. If you're at all interested in those arguments, please do check out the previous videos in Virtual Legality about Stardock, about the DMCA, about copyright in general. They're all under Virtual Legality number 11. Like a good Final Fantasy series, I've named them Virtual Legality 11, Virtual Legality 11-2, and Virtual Legality 11-3. And it talks about the use of the DMCA. It talks about how Ford and Reiche had a fairly novel approach to claiming a DMCA violation by claiming a violation of look and feel of their materials, and also how Star Control wound up indemnifying Steam and GOG to have their game put back on those services. So if you're at all interested in that, do check it out. They're from January and February of this year, and they do give you an interesting background to what happened this last week and why it was so monumental, because we had arrived at that place where if you're familiar with litigation, if you're familiar with commercial disputes, it looked like people were probably too angry at that point in time to come to the table to settle things like they did this past week. Going back to the article, we see that not only did the IP discussions go away, the original 3 Star Control games can continue to be sold on other storefronts, and they're just going to split revenue. This was a fight because maybe the license lapsed, maybe it didn't. Maybe Atari was doing something nefarious with the license, maybe they weren't. No licensing money changed hands. So just so everybody was clear, and this is one thing that if you do have an amicable settlement, and both sides want to make sure that it's clear to the press and the public that no one is really being charged with guilt or anything, they also make clear that no money changed hands. This wasn't somebody buying someone out or buying someone's secrecy as part of the process. And then finally, we have the final 2 bullet points. Brad Wardell of Stardock must furnish Paul Reiche with a specific amount of honey from Wardell's apiary. In turn, Paul Reiche must furnish Brad Wardell with a specific amount of mead brewed from Wardell's bees' honey. And the article says, wait, what? And I highly recommend you read it. I don't want to take all of their thunder. They've got some great interviews here. But suffice it to say, Paul Reiche is in the business of making mead from honey, and Brad Wardell is in the business of making honey from bees. And so they worked out a little arrangement, and it's really a good idea, honestly. It sounds silly, it sounds funny, and it really does go to the kind of individual idiosyncrasies of these folks and the companies that they run. But when you're talking about settlement, when you're talking about building bridges between people that were just recently at each other's throats, it's actually a fantastic idea. And the article goes on to talk about the lawyers getting upset about what was happening, and I can certainly see some of that, especially the bullet point that says, hey, we're just going to drop everything on copyright. We're going to drop anything on intellectual property, because if you don't write that correctly in a settlement agreement, it's going to be confusing and confused as ever. And if you ever decide that you hate each other still, hey, maybe you don't solve the problem with something like this, because it's going to be so difficult to make sure it goes away in its entirety. But for right now, putting the lawyers' complaints aside, and it's easy to do right here in Virtual Legality, put those lawyers' complaints aside, this is a fantastic outcome. And while settlement is common, settlements of this type, which are amicable, which result in more product and a better finale for everybody that's invested in this universe and in this franchise, those are not common. Settlements that are common are ones where you get an NDA and you have a amount of money change hands where one side knows it's in the wrong and the other knows it's in the right. You find the number, you hit the number, everybody goes away, but everybody feels kind of icky about it, and the public never really gets to know what happened behind closed doors. This isn't that. And as a matter of fact, it's clear from this settlement and from the structure that it was made in that it was important to both sides on this that it wasn't that people wouldn't interpret this as something shady or that something dark had happened. And certainly from either side of the spectrum, folks across the internet had been issuing their own judgment about Stardock and about Reiche and Ford. And I think this is an effort, and I think it's a good one, to put that aside, to get the internet to stop judging people, frankly, on things that they don't fully know, on details that they don't fully understand, on people that, frankly, aren't watching Virtual Legality and don't even know the legality of the claims that were being made. And so I think if we take anything away from this, it's that E3 absolutely is a time of celebration, and it's a time where people come together to celebrate video games, and there can be no better example of that than something like this, where two folks, two sides that were fighting tooth and nail for years and which had just escalated their fight to seemingly Death Star levels at the start of this year, wound up coming together halfway through it to make more Star Control, to make better Star Control for everybody that loves that franchise and loves that series. So it's a rare thing in Virtual Legality, but this episode is a very positive take on what can happen, not just with threats of litigation, because I don't think that happened because of those things, but that people can get by that the discovery process and the process that you find out things about each other can help you get to a point where you understand that maybe things are too confrontational, that maybe there is a third path, that there is a way without fighting to get to a place where everybody can be happy, and that you can see folks that love video games as much as these guys do come together to make sure that we get the best versions of those games possible. And frankly, I don't end a lot of these episodes feeling heartened and excited and thrilled about the direction of the video game industry necessarily, but this story in particular gives me a great amount of hope. It fills me with that warmth that E3 can bring in certain respects, and I'm very happy you decided to check it out with me here in Virtual Legality and this episode. That's Virtual Legality for today. If you enjoyed this, please do please share it with anybody you think might be interested. I really do think this is an important and fun story from E3 that probably got swept up underneath the demo of Final Fantasy 13 or the leak of the Avengers footage, and I think more people need to know about it because it really is a good thing. If you caught this on YouTube, thank you so much for watching, and if you caught this on a podcast, thank you so much for listening, and please do review it if available on the service that you listen to it on. And I will catch you on the very next episode of Virtual Legality.